Today we're going to show you how to change disc brakes by doing a disc brake service. We're going to loosen the two caliper bracket bolts. There's one on top, one on bottom. These two bolts need to be loosened with a socket, ratchet, and then we're going to twist them off with our hands. Be careful to not lose these bolts. These bolts actually hold the caliper to the bracket assembly. Make sure we stay organized when we are removing these caliper bolts. After the caliper bolts have been removed, we're going to pull back on the brake caliper itself and hang it off to the side, and then we're going to grab these little pins that are pad spreaders for this particular assembly, remove those clips, and then the brake pads off of the brake caliper bracket. Remove both inner and outer pads. Next, we're going to break loose the caliper bracket bolts. They're larger in size. The caliper bracket bolts to the steering knuckle, and these two bolts keep the bracket aligned with the rotor. We need to remove these two brake caliper bracket bolts to get access to the rotor. So after we've loosened these two bolts, we're going to twist the bottom bolt off and then the top bolt off to remove this bracket. Once we get the bracket off, then we should be able to have exposure to the rotor to remove the rotor, since we're replacing the rotor and pads in this brake job. The rotor is now exposed with the bracket removed, and we slide it off of the hub assembly. This is a new rotor. We're going to clean this new rotor with some brake clean. A lot of our new rotors will be shipped with a light film of oil, and we want to clean off all that oil before we install the brakes. Because we don't want oil on the brakes, we're going to use brake clean to clean it, let it air dry, and then we can put it back onto the hub assembly ready for installation. These are brake hardware clips, and the bracket, I am actually testing the slide pins to see that the caliper will move freely. We are going to actually remove those guide pins and clips, and I'm also inspecting the caliper bracket to make sure it's not bent or broken. This is a new clip we've installed here, and we're going to go through and replace all of the clips with new clips. It's recommended to use new clips when we change the brake pads. These are referred to as brake hardware. We are now cleaning the slide pin or guide pin, could be called either one, and we clean it with some brake cleaner. We wipe the slide pin off with a paper towel or rag, and we're going to clean both of these slide guide pins thoroughly and make sure they're dry, and then we're going to use some synthetic brake grease. It's important that you buy brake grease. This is a synthetic brake grease that we'll use. The boots here we want to inspect, make sure they're not torn or ripped. And this is our brake grease that we're going to lubricate the guide pins. It's important that we lubricate these after we've cleaned them, so then that way they will slide in and out of the caliper housing correctly. You can see I'm installing this slide pin back into the housing, and we want to make sure that the boot seals that to keep contaminants such as dirt and other contaminants from the road outside of the boot so that it doesn't get on that grease. After we've lubricated them, put them back, we're now checking to make sure they move freely. And now we're going to use some of this brake grease on the contact points where we put those new hardware clips. These hardware clips we're lubricating with the synthetic brake grease so that the brake pads will slide inside of that bracket properly. I like to install the brake pads on the brake caliper bracket before I put the brakes back on. It's a little easier to install it on the clips and line up the pads on the bracket before we put the caliper back on over the rotor. Next, we're going to compress the piston of the caliper. We have a C-clamp, and I'm using an old pad to push the piston back into the caliper housing. After the caliper piston is pushed all the way back inside of the caliper itself, I'm going to again make sure there's no stress on the brake hose before I put the bracket back into place. We're going to thread the 2 bolts for the brake bracket. Notice my left hand, I have it holding the brake pads firmly against the rotor. This way, when the rotor moves back and forth, the pads don't come out. I hand tighten the 2 brake caliper bolts for the bracket, and then I'm going to torque those 2 bolts to the specification according to the manufacturer. So I've got a torque wrench here that I'm tightening the 2 brake caliper bolts for the bracket. These are the bracket bolts. Now I'm going to slide the caliper over the bracket and the pads, and I'm going to hand tighten the 2 brake caliper bolts that thread into those slide pins. So on the back of the slide pin, there's some holes there with threads where the 2 bolts will thread into those slide pins to allow the caliper to move back and forth. And I thread them in by hand, make sure I don't cross thread the bolts, and then I'm going to torque them to proper specification. So you have the guide pin bolt torque and the brake caliper bolt torque, and don't mix those up because the guide pin is going to be significantly looser than the bracket. Before you drive away, you always want to pump the brake pedal multiple times to make sure that the pads seat up against the rotor. This is very important, so then that way you can stop.